She was barefoot, shivering, and asleep on concrete. Keanu Reeves tried to give her his coat, but she handed him a blanket instead. Her only possession. What he didn't know. That same woman once lit up Carnegie Hall, and that broken violin by her side would lead him to a son who'd forgotten how to listen. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The crew had already packed up. Lights dimmed, cables coiled, trucks humming with gear. It was one of those long shoots that stretched beyond midnight, when even the air feels thinner and the quiet around a studio becomes almost sacred. Keanu pulled on his jacket and stepped out the side gate, favoring the back alley for the solitude. It was cold, the kind of cold that didn't bite sharply but crept up on you slowly, through your sleeves, your collar, the cracks in your shoes. As he rounded the corner behind the soundstage, he almost didn't see her. A figure lay curled near the wall, tucked beneath a strip of cardboard and an old quilted blanket. One boot was off, revealing swollen, bare toes. Her hair spilled across the sidewalk like ink, streaked with gray, matted from wind and time. Keanu froze. She stirred. Without looking up, she shifted the blanket tighter around her legs, then slowly turned her head. Her eyes blinked into focus, and then, softly, she smiled. "You look cold," she whispered, voice dry but gentle. "Here." Before Keanu could react, she reached out with one thin hand and pushed the blanket toward him. He stared. It was all she had. "No," he said quietly, crouching down. "You need this." But she shook her head with a tired grace. "I've had it long enough," she said. "You're shivering." Keanu's throat tightened. It wasn't just her generosity. It was the way she offered it. Like someone giving away a keepsake, not a blanket. A part of herself. He looked into her face, searching for something to say. She had lines etched deep around her eyes, but they didn't read as bitterness. They read like pages worn from reading the same memory too many times. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Marla," she said, with a small nod. "And you?" He gave her a faint smile. "Keanu." She didn't flinch at the name, didn't blink with recognition or fandom, just smiled again, as if Keanu could be anyone. "You look like someone who listens," she said. He didn't know what that meant, not yet, but he nodded. "You hungry?" he asked. She tilted her head. "You offering something warmer than sidewalk soup?" He smiled. "There's a diner 2 blocks up." "I'll walk slow," she said, "if you're kind enough to let me pretend I'm not limping." They rose together, her hand brushing the wall for balance. He draped the blanket around her shoulders, not as a gift, but as a returned favor. And together, under the humming yellow street lamp, they walked toward warmth neither of them fully understood yet. The diner was nearly empty at that hour. Only a couple of truckers sat at the far end, hunched over mugs of coffee. The buzz of the fluorescent lights hummed above, soft and consistent, a low soundtrack to the kind of conversations that didn't need to be hurried. Keanu held the door open, and Marla stepped in, the warmth hitting her face like memory. Her shoulders dropped ever so slightly, tension giving way to something close to ease. They found a booth near the window. The waitress, an older woman with tired kindness in her eyes, gave Keanu a nod of recognition, but didn't say anything more than, "Coffee?" He nodded. Marla lifted 2 fingers and added, "And some sugar if the gods are kind." The woman chuckled and left them alone. Marla studied the napkin holder, then the salt shaker, then finally Keanu. "You don't talk much," she said. "I listen better," he replied. She smiled, folding her hands around the mug once it arrived. "That's rare these days. Most people talk because they're afraid to be quiet." They sat like that for a while. No rush, no agenda, just silence and steam curling from their cups. Keanu finally asked, "How long have you been on the street?" Marla didn't answer right away. Instead, she traced the edge of the table with her fingertip. "I've been moving for years," she said finally. The sidewalk just happened to be where the world stopped letting me back in. Keanu didn't push. She turned her eyes to the window, watching a passing cab trail light across the glass. Then she said something almost too softly to catch. I used to fill rooms with sound. Now I fall asleep to the echo of my own breath. There was poetry in her voice, not forced, natural, like someone who once spoke through music and was still trying to remember how words were supposed to feel. What kind of music? Keanu asked. Her lips twitched upward. The kind that gets under your skin. Strings, bows, notes that linger longer than they should. He blinked, absorbing that. You played? He asked. She nodded. I lived it, until I didn't. He glanced at her blanket again, folded neatly beside her now. It looked like it had been washed in streetlight and wind more than water. It wasn't just warmth. It was history. And suddenly the way she gave it to him made more sense. Marla wasn't protecting her body that night. She was protecting someone else's spirit. His. After they shared soup and toast, Marla leaned back against the booth and looked out the window like she was listening to something only she could hear. Her fingers tapped gently against the table. Not a nervous tick, but a rhythm. A beat. Familiar. Precise. Keanu watched. You're hearing something, aren't you? He asked. She nodded. I hear music in the quiet places. That's where it hides now. Did you always? Since I was a girl, she said. When the world got too loud, I'd close my eyes and follow the melody under it all. Keanu leaned forward. Do you still play? Marla looked at him, not offended, just tired. I keep the violin close, but I don't think she trusts me anymore. The strings are cracked, the bows warped, and the music... She paused, then looked down. The music left with him. Who? My son. Her voice was steady, but Keanu could hear the ache woven between the syllables. Do you talk to him? No, she said, her hands curling around the coffee cup again. He stopped listening, and I stopped trying to explain. They sat for a few minutes more before she stood slowly, pulling her blanket over her shoulder like a shawl. Thank you, she said, for dinner, and for not asking me to prove anything. Keanu nodded. Can I walk you back? She smiled. Only if I can hum a lullaby on the way. Outside, the city had quieted to its slowest rhythm. Just the soft shuffle of feet, the distant sigh of traffic, and the occasional buzz of neon overhead. Marla didn't speak as they walked. She hummed, a melody Keanu couldn't place, but one that felt achingly familiar. He glanced at her once. She walked with a slight limp, her blanket trailing the ground. But her head was high. As they reached the alley near the studio, she turned to him and said, You don't owe me anything, Keanu, but you listened. That's more than most. He opened his mouth to respond, but she touched his arm. Go home, she whispered. Keep your coat. I've got the music. She turned and curled back into her corner, drawing the blanket around her like a ritual. As Keanu walked away, he looked back once. She was already asleep. But her fingers, they moved against her chest in tiny motions, like she was still playing something in her dreams. And Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just met someone who used to make the world feel whole. The next night, Keanu returned to the alley, not because he felt obligated, but because something about Marla had stayed with him. There was a grace in her that lingered, something unfinished, something left unsaid. He carried 2 small containers of lentil soup, still warm, wrapped in a paper bag. As he turned the corner, he half expected to find the space empty, but she was there, seated upright, her blanket wrapped over her knees. She wasn't sleeping. She was waiting. Marla saw him and smiled, shy this time, like she hadn't expected him to keep his word. I brought dinner, Keanu said. You must be the only man alive who returned soup for a blanket, she replied. He handed her 1 container, then sat beside her on the concrete. The sidewalk was cool, but not sharp, the kind of temperature that reminded you autumn was on its way. They ate slowly, in silence. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A siren blipped once and faded. But in their little corner of the world, it was still. Marla tilted her head after a few bites and said, "You're not here just to feed me." Keanu shrugged. "Maybe not, but I thought you might be hungry again." "I'm always hungry," she said, "but food doesn't always mean soup." After they finished, she wiped her hands gently on the edge of her blanket, then reached behind her makeshift bedding. Keanu hadn't noticed it before. A black, worn violin case. The latch was broken on one side. The other was wrapped in what looked like a shoelace, tied in a patient knot. She untied it carefully, like she was unlocking something sacred. "I usually don't play when people are around," she said, eyes on the case. "Then pretend I'm not here." She opened it. Inside, the violin rested in faded blue velvet lining. It was scarred and dulled, the strings uneven, but something about the way her hands touched it, steady, reverent, made it clear it wasn't just an instrument. It was a piece of her. She placed it under her chin, adjusted the chin rest slightly, and took a deep breath. Then she played. The first note was quiet, almost a whisper, but the next stretched longer, fuller, and by the third, the alley was filled with a sound so haunting and clear, Keanu forgot where he was. It wasn't loud. It was precise. It was the sound of someone who had once commanded rooms and now made peace with empty streets. Marla's eyes were closed as she played. Her fingers glided over the strings with a gentleness that came from deep memory, not just skill. The bow moved slowly at first, then faster, then back to slow, as if she were holding a conversation not with the violin, but with something long buried. Keanu sat frozen, leaning forward slightly, afraid to breathe too loud. Each note seemed pulled from a place that didn't quite belong to the present. It wasn't perfect. There were scratches in the sound, a slight warble in the tuning. But the music held something more important than precision. It held pain. It held longing. It held love. The melody wound upward like smoke, turning corners, brushing past old walls, then curling back toward the earth. There was sorrow in it, a searching, something unfinished. And then, without warning, she stopped, mid-phrase. The bow fell still. The sound vanished. Keanu looked at her. She hadn't dropped the violin. She hadn't made a mistake. She'd simply stopped. He waited, but she didn't resume. Instead, she lowered the violin to her lap and stared at the strings. "I never finish it anymore," she said quietly. Keanu blinked. "Why not?" Marla didn't answer immediately. Her fingers rested on the wood, like she was comforting it. Then she said, "Because he never heard the end." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, sacred. Keanu let it settle. She set the violin down gently and reached for her blanket again. "I wrote that piece for my son," she said. "When he was 5, I used to play it as he fell asleep, every night. He'd close his eyes on the first note and be gone by the 5th. It was the only time the world felt quiet." Keanu nodded, listening. "The last night I played it," she continued, "I only made it halfway through. That was the night I left." She didn't need to explain the rest. The words hung there like ash in cold air. "You never got the ending," she said, "and I didn't either." Keanu looked at the violin, at its worn bridge and frayed bow. "You ever think about playing it for him now?" Marla shook her head slowly. "He stopped listening a long time ago." Keanu didn't press. He only said, "Sometimes people just don't know what they're missing until they hear it again." She looked at him, startled by the hope in his voice. And for the first time that night, her hands trembled. Not from cold, but from memory trying to come back. Keanu stayed a little longer, even after the last note had long faded and the night air grew colder. Marla had tucked the violin back into its case with care, folding a small piece of cloth over the strings as if to keep them warm. She didn't speak much after that. She just sat with her eyes on the corner of the case, her fingers still twitching faintly in her lap, like the music was still playing somewhere in her, even if no one else could hear it. You ever think about what music remembers? She asked suddenly. Keanu looked over at her. What do you mean? She turned her head just slightly toward him. I mean, when no one listens, does the music just disappear? Or does it sit somewhere, waiting to be finished? He thought about that for a long second. Then he said, I think it waits. She smiled gently. That's a kinder answer than I expected. They sat in silence again, until Marla slowly pulled the blanket around her shoulders, like drawing in breath. She looked older than she had the night before, but softer too, more real. Thank you for the soup, she said, and for letting me play without asking for the ending. You didn't need to finish it tonight, Keanu said, but I hope one day you will. Marla nodded faintly, as though the idea was just beginning to root. As Keanu rose to leave, she whispered something so low he almost didn't catch it. Who looked just like me, that's what scared me the most. He paused. My son, she said. His eyes, his silence. He learned to be quiet before I learned how to stay. Keanu turned back toward her, gently rested a hand on the violin case. You're not gone yet, Marla. She looked up at him, a fragile mixture of surprise and sorrow in her eyes. No, she said. Not yet. He left her with a nod and a quiet promise to return. As he walked back toward the car, he realized something had shifted, not just in her, but in him. There was something in her music that didn't just ask to be heard. It asked to be remembered, and he wasn't sure yet what that would mean. Only that she had started playing again. And maybe, just maybe, that meant she hadn't truly stopped. It was the third night in a row Keanu returned. He didn't bring soup this time, just a paper bag with fresh bread, 2 oranges, and a thermos of mint tea. Marla was already awake when he arrived, sitting cross-legged near her makeshift bedding, her blanket folded neatly behind her. She looked up at him, eyes calmer now. You're becoming a habit, she said. Only if it's welcome. She gave a little shrug. Most habits start small, then they carve into your bones. They ate in soft conversation. Nothing urgent, no probing questions. Keanu let her lead. After the tea was gone and the silence had wrapped around them comfortably, Marla leaned over and opened her violin case. Not to play, but to show him something she had never revealed before. I kept the music in here, she said, her voice soft, even when the world forgot I had any left. From beneath the violin's worn lining, she pulled out a small stack of papers and photographs. She laid them out like puzzle pieces on the sidewalk between them. There were yellowed newspaper clippings, concert programs, and torn sheet music, each corner bent and touched with age. In the center, a glossy black and white photograph of a woman in a floor-length gown, violin tucked beneath her chin, bow poised mid-air. It was Marla. Younger, sharper, but the eyes were the same. Keanu leaned closer. One newspaper clipping caught his attention. The headline read, Marla Bennett's bow sets fire to Carnegie Hall. He blinked. You played Carnegie? Marla nodded slowly, almost as if she didn't believe it herself anymore. I was 27. That night changed my life. I thought it was just the beginning. Keanu picked up one of the faded programs. Boston Philharmonic. Featured soloist Marla Bennett. There were 3 more like it. Tchaikovsky, Mendelssohn, Barber. You were the real deal, he whispered. She gave a soft, dry laugh. For a while, yeah, until the music stopped waiting for me. He looked up. What happened? Marla stared down at the sheet music in her lap, her thumb brushing over a handwritten note in the margin. I got lost, she said finally. And my son couldn't wait. Keanu let those words hang. He didn't push. He just sat with her as the photos, the clippings, the life, laid out between them, told a story too big for a single conversation. He looked back at her. What's his name? Marla's eyes held his for a long time. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, Jordan. The name hung in the air longer than either of them expected. Jordan. It didn't sound like a relic. It sounded current, present, like someone who still walked through this world, unaware that someone else whispered his name every night in silence. Keanu repeated it under his breath. Jordan. Marla folded the photos and clippings gently, as though putting pieces of herself back into hiding. She tucked them beneath the violin, closed the lid, and secured the shoelace tie. I haven't said it aloud in years, she admitted. It feels like a song I started, but never finished. Keanu watched her movements. Methodical, but not mechanical. She was holding more than memory. She was holding guilt. Do you know where he is? He asked. She shook her head. I used to. He was in Chicago with his father, but after things happened, I stopped reaching out. I thought maybe it was better if I vanished completely. Because I didn't leave him gently, she said. I was unraveling, and I took the music with me. She sat back, her arms wrapped around her knees, and stared up at the faint outline of the moon behind a web of clouds. He was 12 when I walked out, she said quietly. I told myself it was temporary, that I needed to get clean, get centered, come back better. Keanu nodded, his voice low. But it didn't go that way. No, she said. I lost weeks, then months, and then... The shame made me quiet. Her voice cracked slightly. I kept telling myself I'd make it back, but every day I didn't, the gap grew wider, until I wasn't just late, I was gone. Keanu didn't speak. He just sat there with her, in the weight of everything she hadn't said before now. I mailed him a birthday card once, she said. Didn't sign it, just a drawing, of a violin under a window. What happened to it? No idea, she said. Maybe it got tossed. Maybe he kept it. But I never heard anything back. Keanu leaned forward. What would you say to him now? Marla looked startled by the question. Then, slowly, her eyes began to water. I'd say I'm sorry, she whispered. Not just for leaving, but for letting him believe I stopped loving him. Her voice dropped even lower, and I'd tell him the music didn't stop, it just went quiet. Keanu looked down at the violin case again, the shoelace that held it closed, the truth that still lived inside it. And something in him shifted. This wasn't just about a lost past. It was about a note never played, and a son who still didn't know the song was written for him. The streetlights hummed above them, casting a soft glow on the cracked pavement and quiet truth between them. Marla's hands rested on the violin case like she was guarding not just the instrument, but her very identity. Wrapped, tethered, held together by that shoelace, and silence. Keanu didn't speak for a long time. There was nothing to add. Her story wasn't something to fix, it was something to carry. Still, something stirred inside him. Do you think he still plays? He asked gently. Marla blinked. He used to play cello. Picked it up after I left. I heard once, years ago, that he made it into a youth symphony. Keanu nodded slowly. You think he stayed with it? I hope so, she said. Maybe it gave him what I couldn't. The wind passed between them, carrying the distant scent of something warm, baking, a few blocks away. But neither of them moved. The air felt full, dense with things that hadn't been spoken aloud in decades. Then Keanu leaned forward, his voice steady. If I could find him, would you want him to know you're alive? Marla looked down, her face unreadable at first. After a moment, she spoke. I don't know, she said. I want to believe he deserves peace, and if seeing me gives him that, then yes. But if it hurts him more, if it brings back what he spent years trying to bury, then maybe it's kinder to stay gone. Keanu took in her words carefully, then said, maybe he's still carrying the silence. Maybe what he needs is the ending. Marla's eyes welled up. But what if I don't remember how to finish it? He glanced at the violin. You remember more than you think. She sat in that silence for a long time, hands still on the case, the night pressing soft against them. Then, almost to herself, she whispered, if I could play it again, just once, with him in the room, I think my hands would remember. Keanu rose to his feet, nodding once. I'm going to try, he said. Marla looked up. Try what? To find him, Keanu said. To return the ending to the only person it was meant for. She didn't stop him. She didn't ask how. She just said, if you do, tell him the melody was always his. Keanu turned, the name Jordan repeating in his mind like a line of music not yet resolved. And behind him, Marla picked up the violin case and held it to her chest like it was home. Keanu drove across town the next morning with Marla's violin wrapped carefully in a soft flannel blanket. He had looked up the address the night before. An old luthier's shop tucked between a tailor and a bookstore, hidden in the kind of neighborhood where things weren't trendy, just treasured. The bell above the door jingled gently as he stepped inside. The air smelled of pine resin, old wood, and varnish. The place was silent, except for the slow, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 60s with silver hair tied back and glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up, eyes scanning Keanu with faint recognition, but said nothing. Keanu didn't bother with introductions. He gently unwrapped the violin and placed it on the counter like something sacred. The luthier stopped what he was doing immediately. His eyes sharpened. He stepped forward and adjusted his glasses. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then his fingers moved over the scroll, the pegs, the worn bridge, the deep nicks along the edges. He lifted the violin with a reverence that mirrored Marla's. She still breathes, he murmured. Keanu watched him closely. You recognize it? The man nodded slowly. I made it. Keanu's eyebrows lifted slightly. I apprenticed under Turelli in New York, the man said. This one was crafted for a soloist named Marla Bennett, commissioned for her Ravel debut in Boston almost 30 years ago. Keanu nodded. It's hers. The luthier looked up again, a flicker of something caught between admiration and disbelief. She's alive? Yes, Keanu said. But the instrument, it's been through a lot. The luthier gently rotated the violin, examining the seams, the soundpost, the string wear. She must have stopped playing it for a long time, he said softly. She's just started again, Keanu replied. The old man paused, then gave a quiet nod. Then she's still a musician. Doesn't matter how long it's been. He placed the violin on a velvet mat, opening a drawer beneath the counter filled with brushes, files, tiny chisels, and cloths worn from decades of use. I'll repair it, he said. No charge. Keanu blinked. I can pay. The luthier held up a hand. This isn't for you. It's for her. She gave the world more than it ever gave back. He turned the violin slowly in his hands again, then added, besides, this kind of talent doesn't disappear. It just goes quiet for a while. The back of the shop was lit by a tall window covered in gauzy white curtains that let in enough daylight to make everything glow. Dust floated in the air, soft and unhurried. The luthier moved slowly, not because he was old, but because speed had no place in this kind of work. Keanu sat on a bench near the back wall, watching. The violin had been disassembled with care. The strings were removed. The bridge lay beside the body. The soundpost, tilted and bruised, was being reset. A few wood cracks were being filled with delicate slivers of spruce, smoothed over with tools no longer than a matchstick. The man hummed as he worked, low and tuneless but constant. His hands never shook. Every movement was deliberate. He worked like someone who wasn't fixing something, but inviting it to speak again. You've done this a long time, Keanu said quietly. The luthier didn't look up. 52 years. I've made over 100 instruments, repaired nearly 500, but this one, he paused, running his finger along the edge of the belly. This one never left me. Keanu leaned forward. Why? She was the first musician who made my work feel alive, he said. I remember sitting in the back of the hall during her rehearsal, first time I heard my own instrument cry. Keanu looked toward the workbench. She still plays with that kind of feeling. She always did, the man replied. That violin was never just wood in her hands, it was grief, it was prayer, and it was power. He slid the fine tuner back into place, then reached for a bottle of amber-colored varnish. He dipped a brush the size of a toothpick and began to trace the edges with a soft, steady rhythm. "You know what she told me before that debut?" he asked. Keanu shook his head. She said, "If you build it like it's meant to last forever, I'll play it like I'm not." He let out a quiet chuckle. And she did. My heart nearly stopped during the second movement. It was so raw I thought the wood might split from sorrow. Keanu sat in silence as the luthier added layer after layer of varnish, warming the grain back to life. "She's not done," Keanu said. The luthier looked up for the first time in an hour. "No, she's just been waiting." The air felt still again, like the violin itself had been holding its breath, waiting to be remembered. By the time the violin was fully reassembled, the sun had shifted behind the buildings. The light in the shop had grown gold and soft, casting long shadows across the walls of hanging violas and unfinished cello necks. Keanu remained seated, quiet, hands clasped as if in prayer, watching every motion like it held meaning. The luthier stood at the bench, tightening the new strings slowly. They stretched over the fresh bridge, their metal coils gleaming. He pressed the tailpiece into place and adjusted the pegs with delicate clicks, pausing every few turns to test the tension. Then came the moment. He lifted the violin, nestled it beneath his chin, and drew the bow across it once. The note was warm, not loud, measured, deep, like breath itself. Keanu exhaled. The luthier played a scale, each note rounder than the last. The sound was no longer broken, it was clear, alive. "She's back," he said simply, and handed the violin to Keanu. Keanu hesitated. "I don't play." "You don't need to," the man said. "You're delivering her voice." Keanu took it in both hands. The wood felt smooth, almost new, but carried weight beyond its years. He wrapped it gently back in the same flannel blanket, folding the corners carefully, like someone tucking in a child for sleep. As he turned to leave, the luthier walked him to the door. "Give her this," he said, pressing something into Keanu's hand. A folded, faded sheet of music. "She left this behind all those years ago, said she was still working on the final bars." Keanu opened it. The staff lines were clean, delicate, and sparse. At the bottom, the last few notes trailed off mid-measure. "She never finished it," Keanu said. "No," the man replied. "She said she was waiting for something." Keanu looked up. "Maybe it wasn't something," he said. "Maybe it was someone." The luthier smiled. "Then I hope whoever hears it now knows how lucky they are." Keanu stepped out into the fading afternoon light, the violin secure in his arms, the sheet music pressed flat against his chest. The city moved around him, horns, footsteps, engines. But for a moment, it all felt distant. All that mattered was the sound he hadn't yet heard. The song Marla once started, and the son who still didn't know, he'd been written into it all along. The next morning, Keanu sat across from Sophia in his kitchen, the violin case on the table between them. Its shoelace tie had been replaced by a fresh clasp, but he hadn't opened it. Not yet. Not until it was in the right hands. "She gave you his name?" Sophia asked. "Jordan Bennett," Keanu replied. "She said he used to play cello, youth symphony, in Chicago. That's the last she knew." Sophia's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard. "Give me a minute." She was quiet for a long stretch, scrolling through article after article, page after page. Then she stopped. "Got him," she said. Keanu leaned forward. "Jordan Bennett, principal violist with the West Coast Chamber Orchestra. They're based out of San Diego. Conservatory trained, early career with Chicago Philharmonic, guest appearances in Europe, no mention of family, but..." She turned the screen toward Keanu. "Look at this." He stared at the biography. Under personal background, it read, "Mother unknown, no known surviving family." Keanu sat back. "Who thinks she's gone?" he murmured. Sophia nodded. "Maybe someone told him that?" Maybe he decided it on his own. But either way, she vanished from his story. Keanu looked down at the violin case, then back at the screen. What else do we know? Sophia tapped again. He's scheduled to perform at an arts benefit next week. Black tie, invitation only. I might know someone who can get us in. Not yet, Keanu said. I don't want to blindside him. He reached for the track list of a video embedded in one of the articles. Jordan's most recent performance. It was a string quartet concert, filmed in low light, the camera slowly panning as the musicians played a haunting original composition near the end of the set. Keanu clicked play. The music began soft, familiar, almost hesitant. Then it grew. Keanu's brows pulled together. He leaned in, eyes narrowing. That melody, it was the same one Marla played in the alley. The same arc, the same emotional shape, the same minor to major shift halfway through the second phrase. But then, something changed. Jordan didn't stop where Marla had. He continued, extending the melody, reshaping it, finishing it in a way that felt entirely new. Keanu watched the final note drift off Jordan's bow. The room erupted in applause. Jordan bowed quickly, his face unreadable. Sophia whispered, "He must have been trying to finish what she never did." Keanu nodded. "He's not just her son," he said quietly. "He's her echo." And somewhere between those notes, something unsaid had finally begun to answer back. Keanu sat with the video playing on a loop, watching Jordan's hands glide over the viola again and again. The way he held the bow, the way he paused after the second movement, as if waiting for someone to speak. It wasn't just performance, it was personal. "Do we know if he wrote it?" Keanu asked. Sophia nodded. "It's credited to him, titles Mirrored Light, unpublished, no label, just one performance, ever." Keanu let out a breath. He wrote it for her, or for himself, or maybe both. Sophia leaned forward, her voice softer now. "I think he's been chasing a ghost in the music." Keanu's gaze didn't move from the screen. "And he never knew the ghost still breathes." There was something almost poetic in it. Two musicians separated by time and pain, still speaking to each other through unfinished bars and broken bridges. He didn't know how long Jordan had spent trying to write the ending, but now he knew why it sounded like a conversation without a response. "Could we reach out quietly?" Keanu asked. "Not me, just someone from the foundation. Ask if he'd be willing to meet." Sophia tilted her head. "You want to tell him everything?" Keanu hesitated. "I want to give him the choice." She nodded. "Let me write something that won't scare him off." While she drafted the message, Keanu opened the violin case at last. The repaired wood gleamed beneath the flannel wrap. It looked stronger now, not younger, but restored. Like it had lived through something and returned with scars that didn't hurt anymore. He took out the faded sheet music the luthier had given him and placed it beside the instrument. The staves at the bottom were still blank. Maybe that space wasn't a silence. Maybe it was an invitation. Later that evening, Sophia forwarded the email she'd sent to Jordan's agent. It was careful, neutral in tone, but hinted at something deeply personal. Keanu read it twice. He didn't expect a reply quickly, but the next morning, one was waiting in his inbox. Subject line, regarding the inquiry. It was from Jordan himself. It read, "I'm not sure why this message felt different, but something told me to answer. I don't usually meet strangers, but I'm willing to listen where and when." Keanu stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "Whenever you're ready. I'll bring the music." He hit send, then closed the laptop, the violin still resting beside him. And somewhere deep inside him, the unfinished song Marla had carried for decades began to hum again. The meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon in a small rehearsal studio near the downtown arts district. Keanu arrived early, carrying the violin case in one hand, a simple folder in the other. He wasn't nervous, but he was aware. Every step closer to Jordan felt like stepping through a score someone else had written. The room was bare except for 2 chairs, a stand, and a piano no one had touched in years. The walls were padded for sound, yet the quiet still felt deep. At exactly 2 o'clock, the door opened. Jordan walked in, tall, poised, with a musician's posture and the same quietly alert eyes as his mother. His movements were calm, but his face held tension. Not suspicion, more like someone bracing for something he hadn't allowed himself to hope for. "You must be Keanu," he said simply. Keanu stood. "Thanks for coming." Jordan glanced at the violin case. "You said you were bringing something." Keanu nodded, then gently set the case on the chair and opened it. Jordan's eyes dropped. They widened, not in recognition of the instrument, but something deeper, something sensed. Keanu waited. Then he spoke, voice steady. "This belonged to your mother." Jordan's body didn't move, but his face, his entire expression, shifted in an instant. "My what?" Keanu nodded. "Her name is Marla. Marla Bennett. She was a soloist, Boston Philharmonic, Carnegie Hall." Jordan took a breath like someone who'd been hit with a memory he never lived. "My father told me she died," he said softly. "She didn't," Keanu said. "She left, not because she wanted to abandon you, but because she thought the silence would hurt you less than the struggle." Jordan stepped forward slowly, looking at the violin. His hand hovered over it, but didn't touch. "She played me a lullaby," he whispered. "I was a child. I barely remember the notes. But when I started writing, the melody came back. Over and over." Keanu opened the folder, handed him the sheet music. Jordan read it slowly, stopping at the empty staves at the bottom. "She never finished it," Keanu said. "She said she was waiting." Jordan closed his eyes. "I think I tried to finish it, my way." He looked up, something breaking open in his voice. "But I didn't know why it never felt complete." Keanu nodded. "Because she didn't stop loving you. She just thought you'd be better off not hearing the end." Jordan didn't speak for a long time. Then gently he lifted the violin, placed it beneath his chin, and drew one slow note. Low, soft, trembling. It wasn't a performance. It was the beginning of an answer. That evening, after his meeting with Jordan, Keanu sat quietly in his home office, staring at the keyboard. The violin had been returned to Marla's hands, and the first conversation between mother and son had finally begun. But something inside him still felt unfinished. Not for them, for everyone else. For the ones who might never get the reunion, who lived with silence instead of closure. He opened his laptop. There was no fanfare, no announcement, just a blank screen and a single prompt he typed at the top. "Has music ever connected you to someone you lost? Share your story below." Then, in the body of the post, he began to type. Carefully, slowly. "I once met a woman on the street who offered me her only blanket. She had nothing, not even a place to rest her head. But she gave me comfort. She told me she used to play music in concert halls, that her violin had once held the kind of beauty that stopped time. She hadn't touched it in years. She'd lost someone. A son. And in losing him, she lost her voice. But music has a strange way of surviving even the things we don't say. Sometimes a melody waits, and sometimes someone else finds it, finishes it, without even knowing they were always part of the song. If you've ever had a song bring back someone you thought was gone, if music has ever made you cry without knowing why, you're not alone. This is for the mothers who stopped playing, for the children who kept listening, for the stories that never had a final note. Tell us yours. He sat back, stared at the screen, and hit post. Then he closed the laptop and walked outside, into the quiet night, where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The response came quickly. By the next morning, thousands of comments had poured in, more than any post he'd ever made before. They came from every corner of the world, written in different languages, different time zones, but echoing the same chord. A note remembered. a song unfinished, a moment of connection too fragile for words, but perfect in sound. Keanu sat in the corner of his living room, coffee growing cold beside him, the screen of his phone glowing with comment after comment. He didn't refresh. He didn't need to. They kept arriving on their own, like waves at high tide, one story rolling in just as another whispered out. A woman from Kentucky wrote, "My father used to whistle when he worked on his truck. After he passed, I walked by a music store and someone inside was humming the same tune. I broke down on the sidewalk. I never knew how deeply that little song had rooted in me." A teenage boy from Poland wrote, "My older sister played piano before she got sick. I couldn't listen to anything for months after we lost her. Then, one day, a stranger played the same piece on a public square piano. I stood in the cold and cried." A former cellist in New York shared, "I played in a subway station once, not for money, just to feel something again." An old man walked up, placed his hand on the cello and said, "My wife used to play that piece. She died last winter, but for a moment you brought her back." We didn't speak after that, but I never forgot him. Keanu read each one slowly, deliberately, as if tasting them. The stories weren't polished, many were short, a sentence or two, but their truth struck like lightning. I heard my mother's voice in a hymn I hadn't heard since I was 10. I found a cassette in my grandmother's attic, her lullaby to me, singing over static. I thought I'd imagined her voice. I hadn't. After my son passed, I couldn't touch the guitar for 5 years. One night, I strummed a single chord. It wasn't music. It was memory. Some replies had nothing to do with instruments. I used to hum to my daughter before bed. She passed in her sleep at 6 months. I still hum sometimes, just in case she can still hear. Keanu wiped his eyes once, then again. He looked at the violin across the room. Marla's violin. Reborn. Waiting. He didn't know what it was about music that reached so deeply into the parts of us we forgot how to access. But he knew now, without question. When someone can't say what they feel, music becomes the body's way of remembering for them. And sometimes, even the silence between notes is still a love letter. Later that evening, Keanu walked into the Foundation's outreach center and found the community bulletin board already covered in printouts of the comments. Sophia had begun pinning them up by hand, creating a collage of grief, memory, and hope. Some comments were printed on bright paper, others handwritten by volunteers who had transcribed stories from older viewers who preferred to call instead of type. In the center of the display, someone had posted the original prompt: "Has music ever connected you to someone you lost?" Keanu stood there for a long time, reading in silence. An older man in a gray beanie had written, "I haven't spoken to my daughter in 12 years, but her voice was always in the piano. I'm going to send her the post. Maybe that's how we start again." A young woman from Arizona simply wrote, "He died before we danced at our wedding, but I still wear the shoes." It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about memory stitched into melody, about longing wrapped in rhythm, about how grief doesn't always roar, it hums. Sophia came up beside him. "I didn't think it would go this far." Keanu nodded slowly. "It didn't go far, it went deep." She looked at him. "Do you think Jordan will read these?" "I hope so," Keanu said, "because he's not the only one who grew up thinking silence meant the end." She leaned against the wall. "Do you think Marla should see them?" He thought about that. He imagined her sitting beside her blanket, reading stories from strangers who had also lost people, who had also let music do what words never could. "Yes," he said softly, "but only when she's ready." The board kept filling. A handwritten poem appeared in the corner, a sketch of a cracked violin with music notes spilling out of the body, a single line written in blue marker. "I heard him again when I stopped being afraid of sound." Later, after the building had emptied and the lights dimmed to soft orange, Keanu returned to the board and placed one final card in the center. It read, to the ones who never stopped listening, even when there was nothing left to hear. He stepped back, the card trembling slightly as the ventilation kicked on. And in that moment, surrounded by strangers' confessions, anonymous sorrows, and unsent songs, Keanu realized something simple and true. Music wasn't the bridge. It was the home we could return to, even when no one waited on the other side. Keanu arrived at the concert hall just before the rehearsal began. The high-ceilinged space was quiet, save for the soft murmur of musicians tuning their instruments. The lights above them flickered in time with the tapping of the conductor's foot, and the air smelled faintly of rosin and fresh sheet music. Jordan was at the front, standing tall, directing the orchestra with a subtle grace. His eyes never left the sheet music, but his body was in perfect sync with the movements of the ensemble. His hands swept through the air like a pianist guiding the melody, delicate yet commanding. Keanu stood at the back, leaning against the door frame, observing quietly. Jordan led with quiet intensity, a commanding presence not through words but through actions. There was no force in his movement, just a calm, practiced fluidity that came from years of silence and understanding. He looked like someone who had spent a lifetime listening rather than speaking. Keanu watched as Jordan moved between sections, adjusting the violins, then the woodwinds, his fingers barely twitching to give cues. The music swelled and fell, a symphony that seemed to pulse in his veins as much as in the air. Keanu's mind wandered briefly back to the first time he had watched a rehearsal like this, so many years ago, when he was still discovering the power of his own voice. Now, in the midst of this orchestra, he was struck by something deeply personal. The understanding of how a person, raised in silence, could still wield such power over sound. The final note echoed through the hall and the musicians fell silent. Jordan raised his hand for them to remain still, eyes focused on his sheet music. After a long pause, he lowered his arm. Keanu took a deep breath, preparing himself. This was it, the moment to speak to the man who had unknowingly been a part of something much larger than himself. As the musicians stood, stretching and packing their instruments, Keanu made his way to the front of the stage. He approached Jordan quietly, but not without purpose. Jordan glanced up, his expression unreadable, but his gaze softened just a touch when he saw who it was. "You must be Keanu Reeves," Jordan said, his voice measured, carrying a mix of curiosity and professionalism. Keanu nodded. "I am. I've heard you play." He paused. "In fact, I've been listening for a long time." Jordan raised an eyebrow, a small hint of surprise in his posture. "Have you? I don't recall." Keanu hesitated, but pressed on. "Your mother's music. I believe she was the one who taught you the pieces you've been playing." Jordan's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second. The slight change in his demeanor didn't escape Keanu, but Jordan quickly masked it with a practiced calm. "I haven't heard that name in 20 years, Jordan said flatly. He took a slow step back, his posture stiffening slightly. "Is this about her?" Keanu nodded gently. "It is, but I'm not here to dredge up the past. I just think it's time you knew something important." Jordan's expression closed further, as if a door were quietly closing between them. He nodded once, turned, and walked away, leaving Keanu standing in the silence of the empty hall. Keanu watched Jordan walk away, his steps measured, purposeful. It wasn't the coldness Keanu had expected. It was something else, something quieter. A shield, built from years of silence and unspoken pain. Keanu didn't follow him immediately. Instead, he stood there, in the center of the hall, listening to the faint echoes of the rehearsal lingering in the walls. He let the silence settle around him, the absence of the music now louder than the sound had been. Jordan's reaction had been what Keanu feared. But it wasn't anger. It wasn't even rejection. It was simply the quiet aftermath of a life that had been distanced, intentionally or not, from the one thing that could heal it: music. Keanu rubbed his hand over his face, exhaling sharply. There was no denying it. He had reached out with good intentions. But reaching someone who had been lost, whether by choice or circumstance, wasn't as easy as extending a hand. The past had a way of locking people in place, keeping them from moving forward. He glanced at the door where Jordan had disappeared, his thoughts weighing heavily on him. It wasn't just a violin Keanu had brought to him. It was something deeper, something Marla had never gotten the chance to explain. He could feel that in Jordan's eyes, a wall, still standing tall and unmoving. Keanu couldn't let it end there, not after everything he had witnessed, not after seeing the same longing in Jordan that he had seen in Marla when they first met, the same silence in their eyes. He stepped toward the door, but before he could leave the hall, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. A young woman in a conductor's jacket approached him, holding a small envelope. Her face was familiar from the orchestra program. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Jordan wanted me to give this to you." Keanu took the envelope from her, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. She nodded and stepped back, disappearing into the backstage area as he stood there, the weight of the letter heavy in his hand. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a small, folded note. "Tell her I'm not angry, but I'm not ready yet." Keanu let the words sit in his hand for a moment. Jordan wasn't rejecting the idea of seeing his mother. He was simply still afraid of the same things that had kept him silent all these years. Keanu tucked the note into his jacket pocket. This wasn't over. Not yet. Keanu left the rehearsal hall, the note still tucked safely in his pocket. He stepped outside into the crisp air, his breath visible in the evening light. The city felt quieter tonight, as if the weight of the day's interactions had softened the usual hum of traffic and movement. He didn't know what he had expected from Jordan. Certainly not this guarded reaction, not this hesitation, but it made sense. If anyone understood how silence could shape a life, it was Keanu. He had spent years in the quiet spaces between his own memories, his own relationships, trying to reconcile the parts of himself that he thought had been lost forever. But Jordan wasn't lost. He was just waiting for the right time, the right words, the right moment to finally step forward into the music that had once been his connection to his mother. Keanu's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Sophia. "The luthier sent the photos of the repairs. The violin looks incredible. We're almost ready." Keanu smiled faintly. The violin was waiting. Marla's song was still waiting. He knew what he had to do. He called Sophia, his voice firm but quiet. "Get me everything you can on Jordan's next performance. The venue, the date, everything." Sophia's voice came back on the line. "What are you planning, Keanu?" "I'm going to help him finish the song," he said simply, "and I'm not going to let him do it alone." He hung up, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just about reconnecting mother and son. It was about finishing something that had been left in the air for far too long. Music didn't belong to the past. It belonged to the future, to the people who still had the courage to hear it, to play it, to finish it. Keanu walked toward his car, the night air cold against his skin. The note in his pocket felt heavier now, like the first step in a new direction. Jordan wasn't ready yet, but he would be, and Keanu was determined to be there when he finally took that step. The violin was only the beginning. The real song had yet to be played. Keanu stood outside Marla's makeshift shelter in the dimming light of evening. The city was still alive with the hum of cars and distant conversations, but here, on this quiet street corner, time seemed to slow. The world had shrunk down to this moment, this violin, and the woman who had once made it sing. He could hear her before he saw her, soft humming, like a memory escaping her lips, lingering in the space between the chords of a song only she could hear. Marla was sitting on a curb near the alleyway where they'd met, her eyes closed, her back against the building. In her hands was the violin, now repaired, its varnish gleaming softly under the street lamp. The sound of the strings had once been lost in the silence of her absence, but now they carried with them the memory of everything she'd ever been. Keanu approached, slowly, the weight of the violin in his hand feeling heavier with each step. When he reached her, he knelt down and placed the instrument gently at her side. Her eyes fluttered open. Her gaze met his, but there was something fragile in it, like a part of her still wasn't sure if she was ready to touch the past again. "The violin's fixed," Keanu said softly. "It's ready." Marla didn't move, didn't reach for it. Instead, her eyes watered, and she let out a quiet, shaky breath. "I don't know if I deserve to play it again," she whispered, almost to herself. Keanu's heart ached at the quiet vulnerability in her voice. He wanted to tell her that she did, that this was her right, that music had never abandoned her, and neither had the love she'd given it. But he didn't say that. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply replied, "He's playing your music." Her eyes flickered with something, a spark of recognition, of longing, and for a long moment she just sat there, staring at the violin in front of her. Keanu shifted, standing a few paces away to give her space. He watched her, but didn't pressure her. She wasn't ready. Not yet. The city around them seemed to fade away. She was lost in her thoughts, her fingers hovering near the strings of the violin. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, she picked it up. It was slow, deliberate, the violin cradled carefully in her arms like a fragile, precious thing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, under the street lamp's glow, Marla lifted the bow, and the first hesitant note broke the silence. It was soft at first, uncertain, but then, slowly, it grew. Marla's bow moved gently across the strings, coaxing a sound from the violin that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. The first notes were quiet, tentative, like someone waking from a long sleep, unsure whether the world had changed while they were gone. Keanu stayed a few steps away, watching, letting the music fill the space between them. The dim street light above them flickered slightly, casting shadows on the pavement. Marla's face was serene now, her eyes closed in concentration, and the bow slid back and forth with careful intent. Keanu felt it then, the music, how it began to wrap itself around him like a memory he hadn't realized he'd forgotten. It was as though he had always known this song, its quiet intensity, its emotional pull. And suddenly, it was more than just a tune. It was everything that Marla had lost and everything she was finally reclaiming. The violin sounded different now, not as it had before, the sharp, broken notes of her silence, but smooth, rich, full of feeling. Every note was a step, each one a moment. She had given up long ago but was now finding again. Keanu's heart swelled, his chest tight. He wanted to say something, to acknowledge how incredible this moment was, but he knew better than to interrupt. There was a sacredness in the air now, something raw and profound that even words couldn't touch. Then Marla paused. The bow hovered over the strings, her eyes still closed, as if she were waiting for something. Permission, perhaps? Or simply the courage to continue? Keanu took a slow breath, watching her closely. The memory of the song, of the melody she had carried inside her for so long, was there in the room with them now. It didn't belong to the past anymore. It was alive. It was here. After a long silence, she began again. The sound of the violin was clearer this time, the notes more confident. The music began to flow like a river finding its course, every note stronger than the last, building into something that Keanu could no longer sit still for. He moved closer, quietly, as if drawn by an invisible force. She finished a long phrase and allowed the last note to hang in the air, lingering before gently letting it fade into the night. She stopped and lowered the violin, still cradled in her arms. "I couldn't finish it for him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Keanu walked over slowly, kneeling down beside her. The streetlight cast soft shadows across her face, but her eyes were full of something he couldn't name. "You didn't have to," he said quietly. "You finished it for yourself. And she nodded, but her eyes were moist, glistening in the light. It wasn't relief, it was something deeper, something she had been carrying for too long, something that had finally found its way out. Keanu didn't speak for a long time, and neither did she. The silence was comfortable now, like a quiet understanding between them. And in that moment, Keanu realized that music, just like love, didn't always need to be finished. Sometimes, just the act of beginning was enough. Finally, a soft clap broke the stillness. Keanu turned his head. A man in a worn coat stood a few feet away, watching them. He had been passing by, clearly intrigued by the sound. His face was weathered, his hands deep in his pockets, but he stood there now, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. Marla's eyes flicked to him, and she offered a small, shy smile. "Thank you." Keanu stood slowly, the weight of the moment settling over him like a heavy blanket. He could feel it, the transformation. Marla had given the world something it didn't know it needed, and now even this stranger understood it. The man nodded again, then turned and walked away, disappearing back into the city's shadows, leaving them alone again. Keanu looked at Marla, who still held the violin against her chest, her hands trembling. "You did it," he whispered, his voice full of quiet awe. "You finished it." She nodded again, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something more, but no words came. Keanu smiled softly and walked over to her. "Come on, let's go find your son." Marla didn't respond, but Keanu saw the way her eyes brightened. Just a little. And that was enough. Keanu watched as Marla put the violin down gently, almost reverently, and looked out into the night. The sounds of the city returned, though softer now, as if the music had momentarily muted everything around them. Marla's shoulders were still slumped, but there was a quiet confidence in the way she held herself now, as if playing the song had unburdened something deep inside her. Keanu felt the moment, the weight of it. The music that had once been lost was now a part of the world again. Her music was not forgotten, and even if no one else had been here to hear it, he knew the city had listened. Even the stranger who had clapped knew something powerful had just happened. "Thank you," Marla whispered, almost as if speaking to herself, "for bringing me back to it." Keanu smiled softly. "You didn't need me for that. You just needed to believe you could play again." She looked up at him, and for the first time since they met, her gaze was open. "I thought I had lost it. The music, my son, everything." Keanu shook his head. "Sometimes the music never leaves. Sometimes it just waits for the right moment." Marla's lips trembled slightly. "And sometimes we just have to start playing again." Keanu placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this." Marla nodded, her eyes wet with tears she hadn't allowed to fall before. She glanced toward the street lamp and the empty space between them and the world. Then, as if remembering something, she stood slowly. "You're right," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm ready, I just didn't think anyone would care." Keanu looked out at the street, the distant hum of the city filling the air around them. "I care, and maybe it's time for your son to hear what he never could before." The wind picked up slightly, brushing past them as if to carry the sound of the music onward, across the streets, the blocks, the city, everywhere it needed to go. And in that moment, Keanu realized it wasn't just about the song. It was about hope. The hope that someone would listen. The hope that someone would care enough to give them back the lost things they didn't even realize they were missing. "Let's go," Keanu said softly, looking at her with a renewed sense of purpose. Marla nodded, her face alight with something Keanu couldn't name. It was gratitude, sure, but it was more than that. It was the kind of recognition that no amount of time or silence could erase. She gathered the violin carefully, a fragile thing made whole again by the hands that never truly stopped believing in it. Keanu sat at a small corner table, the quiet hum of the cafe surrounding him. The warm scent of coffee and fresh pastries filled the air, But it wasn't enough to ease the nervous energy buzzing in his chest. He had been here before, in quiet corners, in unfamiliar places, waiting for something he couldn't predict. This time, it wasn't a press meeting or a scheduled visit. It was a conversation that had been building for weeks, without anyone quite knowing where it would lead. Jordan walked in a few moments later, his tall frame cutting through the crowd. His gaze flickered over the room before locking onto Keanu. He nodded, a faint, stiff smile on his lips. Keanu stood up to greet him, shaking his hand briefly, before gesturing for him to sit down. "I'm glad you came," Keanu said, his voice steady but calm. Jordan nodded again, his movements deliberate as he sat. He adjusted his jacket, smoothing the sleeves, and placed his hands on the table. His eyes were tired, but there was something else beneath them. Curiosity, hesitation, something more than just the need for answers. It was the need for closure. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jordan began, his voice low, almost too soft for the bustling cafe around them. "About my mother, about the music. I never thought I'd get a chance to understand any of it." Keanu nodded, giving Jordan the space to continue. Jordan's eyes fell to his coffee cup. She was always gone. Not physically, but emotionally. Music was her life, and we were secondary. I don't blame her for it. I just never really understood it. Keanu leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice gentle. She was lost too, Jordan. Lost in a way that no one could fix, not even her music. Jordan's gaze shifted briefly, like he was considering the weight of those words. "I get that now. I think I've always understood it. But she left without saying goodbye, without ever telling me what happened." Keanu let the silence sit between them for a moment before he spoke again. "She didn't leave you on purpose. She thought silence was better than dragging you into her own pain." Jordan turned his gaze to Keanu. "That's the thing. I don't even know if she knew she was doing it. I don't know if she knew how much it hurt me to be forgotten." Keanu's hand shifted to the bag beside him, his fingers brushing over the object inside. He pulled it out slowly, setting it down on the table. A small recording device. "This is a recording of your mother," Keanu said softly, "playing the piece you've been trying to finish, her version of it. I thought you might want to hear it." Jordan's eyes softened for a moment, as if a piece of him had cracked open. He stared at the device, his fingers twitching as if to reach for it, but he didn't. Not yet. Keanu continued. "It's not perfect, but it's hers, and it's the part of her you never got to hear." The weight of those words hung in the air. Jordan's breath caught, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Finally, Jordan reached out, his hand shaking slightly as he took the recorder. His fingers hovered over the play button, and Keanu could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation that had been building in Jordan's heart for years. He pressed play. The first notes of the violin played through the recorder, faint but unmistakable. It was soft at first, just a quiet hum of strings, tentative, uncertain, as if the instrument itself was unsure of its place in the world. Then the melody took shape, just as Keanu had remembered it. The curve of it, the lightness, the sorrow in the minor chords. But there was something more in this version, something tender, fragile. Jordan's face went still as he listened. His eyes, usually so guarded, were wide now, as if he were holding on to something intangible. His fingers tightened around the recorder, the music flowing through him. It was more than just a tune. It was his mother. And for the first time, he could hear her without the years of silence that had separated them. Keanu watched him closely, sensing the weight of the moment. The music filled the space between them, every note drawing a line through the years that had kept Jordan from his mother's love. The piece began to swell, a slow crescendo, but then, just like before, it halted, unfinished, unresolved. Marla's last note lingered, echoing in the room. The violin stopped. Jordan blinked rapidly, his face pale, his lips trembling slightly. He hit pause on the recorder, his breath shallow. "That's the piece," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But hers ends where mine begins." Keanu sat back, his gaze softening. He didn't say anything at first, giving Jordan the space he needed to absorb it. The silence between them felt heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only exists after a long-awaited truth has been revealed. Jordan finally looked up, his eyes filled with something Keanu hadn't seen before. It wasn't just pain or loss, it was relief. She never finished it for me," Jordan said, his voice quiet, as if speaking the words out loud would make them too real. "I never got to hear the ending." Keanu nodded slowly. "She didn't think you could, but she always intended to." Jordan's hand hovered over the recorder, still in his lap. "She left me a part of her I didn't know was there. I never thought I'd hear this again, not from her." Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Your music, it's part of her too. You finished it. You gave her voice again, even after all these years." Jordan's lips pressed into a thin line, the first crack in his composure showing through. "I always wondered why I could never finish it, why it didn't feel right." He looked at Keanu, a mix of awe and something else in his gaze. "I thought I was failing her. I didn't realize she was waiting for me to finish it." Keanu gave him a gentle smile. "She wasn't waiting for you to finish the song. She was waiting for you to hear it." Jordan closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. When he opened them again, there was something different in them, something brighter. The weight of the past few years seemed to lift just slightly. "I never realized how much I needed to hear her again," Jordan whispered. I thought I had to do it all alone. I thought I was supposed to bury it." Keanu reached out, placing a hand on the table between them. "You're not alone, Jordan. You never have been." Jordan nodded, wiping his eyes quickly. "It feels like I'm hearing her for the first time, as a person, not just a memory. I've been carrying her in silence, but she never meant for me to carry that weight alone." Keanu gave him a look of quiet understanding. "You've always had her with you. The music was just waiting for you to hear it again." Jordan sat back in his chair, looking at the recorder in his hands. He stared at it for a moment before gently placing it back on the table, the weight of the moment settling over him. Finally, he spoke, his voice raw but strong. Do you think I could play it now?" Keanu smiled, a deep warmth spreading through him. "I think you're ready." Jordan closed his eyes, his fingers brushing against the recorder once more. This time, he didn't press play. Instead, he sat quietly, letting the music play in his mind. Jordan sat quietly, the weight of the violin's history resting on his shoulders. Keanu watched him carefully, knowing how much this moment meant. The piece he had just played had been more than just notes. It was a bridge between two people who had been separated for far too long. But even as Jordan grasped the enormity of that, there was something more he needed to understand. Something Marla had always known. Music doesn't end. It just changes form. Jordan finally looked up from the recorder and met Keanu's gaze. His eyes were wet, but the sorrow was tempered with relief. It was as though, in that brief moment of music, he had touched the very essence of his mother's soul. The one thing he'd longed for, but had never truly understood until now. "I think I'm ready to finish it," Jordan said softly, his voice shaky but firm. "Not the way she did, but in my own way. I don't want to let it go anymore." Keanu smiled, that deep understanding spreading across his face. "You don't have to. It's never really been gone." Jordan reached for the recorder again, but this time, instead of pausing it, he played it from the beginning. The familiar melody filled the room once again, but this time it wasn't incomplete. He added his own voice to the song, a new note that fit perfectly with the old. Keanu could hear the difference. It wasn't just Jordan playing, it was his version of the piece, a version that carried everything Marla had left behind and everything Jordan had found within himself. When the last note faded, Jordan exhaled heavily, his shoulders slumping for a moment. Then, he looked at Keanu. "I never thought I'd be able to do it. I thought I'd be stuck in that silence forever. But now it feels like she's here with me." Keanu leaned forward, watching the young man before him. "You've always had her with you. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. You'll keep playing, and she'll always be there." Jordan smiled weakly, but with a newfound sense of peace. "Thank you." Keanu stood up, offering his hand. "No need for thanks. You did the work. You found the sound." Keanu arrived early, as usual, and watched the sunset cast long shadows across the quiet street. The spot he had chosen for the meeting was small, just a bench by the old park where the trees stood bare, their branches swaying in the evening breeze. It was perfect, isolated enough to shield them from prying eyes, yet intimate enough to make a connection. Keanu glanced at his phone again, checking the time. He had arranged everything carefully. Jordan, now fully aware of the past and the music that bound him and his mother, was ready to meet her. The invitation was simple. She wants to hear the music. But there was one issue Keanu couldn't quite get around. Marla wasn't sure about the meeting. "I don't want his pity," she had told him earlier that day, her voice soft but firm. "I don't need it. I just need him to hear what I couldn't finish." His music. Our music. Keanu understood, of course. He had seen the way Marla avoided the world for years, thinking that time had stolen her chance to repair the broken pieces of her life. She had spent so long carrying the weight of unfinished songs, lost connections, and unspoken regrets. This wasn't about forgiveness. This wasn't about explanations. It was about something deeper, something only music could touch. Keanu turned his head when he saw her approaching. She was walking slowly, the violin case held carefully in her arms, the same one that had been repaired weeks ago, now polished and gleaming under the fading sunlight. Her face was unreadable, her expression quiet, but there was a certain purpose in the way she moved. She had made her decision. Marla reached him, standing silently for a moment before lowering the violin case onto the bench beside him. She sat down, her fingers lightly grazing the worn surface of the case. "You think he'll come?" she asked, her voice still soft, but there was a tremor in it now, one that betrayed the emotions she was holding back. Keanu nodded, his eyes steady. "He's already here," he said simply. They didn't speak much after that. Keanu sat with her for a while, letting the moment settle. It was one of those rare times when the weight of words wasn't needed. They were both ready for what was coming, in their own way. Marla needed to play her piece, Jordan needed to hear it, and the rest, the silence between them, would tell its own story. The soft sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and Marla looked up, her eyes searching. Keanu stood up and gave her a nod. The violin case was opened with practiced hands, the instrument inside still fragile, but ready. They were moments away from something neither of them had expected, and yet both had longed for. As the final steps approached, Marla's breath caught in her chest. She wasn't just about to play music. She was about to heal a part of her heart she had kept hidden for far too long. The sound of footsteps grew closer, and Marla's fingers tightened around the violin's neck. Keanu watched her, sensing her hesitance. He stepped back, allowing her the space she needed. It wasn't the first time she had been nervous about her music, but this time, it felt different. This wasn't a performance. This was a reunion. The evening air had cooled, the last traces of sunlight dipping below the horizon, and the world around them seemed to pause. A man appeared in the distance, walking slowly but with purpose. It was Jordan. His face was calm, but there was something behind his eyes, something held back, as though he were trying to reconcile the past and the present. Keanu remained where he was, watching. It was up to them now. Jordan reached them, stopping a few feet away. His gaze flickered to the violin case before meeting Keanu's eyes. Then Marla's. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't oppressive. It was expectant. Marla didn't say anything. She simply opened the case and pulled the violin from its protective casing. The familiar weight of it settled into her hands like an old friend. She adjusted it carefully under her chin, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the feel of the instrument take over. Jordan looked at her, the same mix of awe and trepidation in his gaze. The air between them was thick with emotion, but neither of them spoke. Finally, Marla looked up at him, her eyes soft but resolute. "You ready?" she asked quietly. Jordan didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached for his own violin, which had been resting against his side, and set it in his hands, his fingers already tracing the strings. And then, without another word, they began. The first few notes were tentative, both of them finding their place. It wasn't just about the melody, it was about the conversation happening between the two of them. Marla played the notes she had known for so long, the ones she had longed to finish. And Jordan, without hesitation, began to add his own voice to the song. It was more than just music. It was a bridge, a connection, a shared experience that neither of them had known they needed until this very moment. As they played, Keanu couldn't help but close his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. The melody filled the space between them, harmonizing in ways words could never do. Each note was a step forward, each pause was an acknowledgement, and with every stroke of the bow, something that had been broken began to heal. The unfinished piece, the one that had haunted them both for so long, was now complete, not because it had a perfect ending, but because it had finally found its place in the world again. Marla and Jordan played through the entire piece. The music didn't stop when it finished. It lingered, hanging in the air, in the spaces between them. For the first time in years, they didn't need words. They didn't need explanations. As the final note ended, the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full of the unspoken emotions that had been left in that space between them for so long. The last note faded into the night, leaving behind a resonating silence. Marla's bow slowly lowered, and she opened her eyes. The music hung in the air like a breath held too long, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. Jordan didn't immediately move, his violin still pressed to his shoulder. He stared ahead, his face unreadable. The street lamp above them flickered, casting a soft glow over the two musicians, each holding on to something precious, something they'd almost lost forever. Then, as if breaking free from a spell, Jordan lowered his violin and looked at Marla. His gaze was soft now, without the hardness that had once been there. His eyes were filled with something Keanu had seen in others, but rarely so clearly: relief, hope, a quiet peace. Marla slowly set her violin down beside her and looked at Jordan, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She didn't speak at first, just watched him, as if waiting for something. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jordan spoke. His voice was hoarse but steady. "I've waited so long to hear it, to hear you." Marla smiled faintly, a tear escaping her eye. She reached out, her hands trembling, and Jordan leaned forward, meeting her in the middle. Without words, without hesitation, they embraced. It was a brief, quiet embrace, one full of years of longing, regret, and the healing that had finally come. Keanu stood a few feet away, his hands tucked in his pockets. He didn't move, didn't intrude. He simply watched, his heart full. This wasn't about grand gestures or speeches. It wasn't about fixing something that had been broken. It was about letting the music do what words couldn't. After a long moment, Marla pulled away, looking up at Jordan with a soft, tearful smile. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jordan shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible laugh escaping his lips. "You don't need to apologize anymore." Keanu approached them then, stepping carefully into their shared space. He smiled at both of them, his voice gentle. "You've done it," he said. "The music, the healing, it's all here." Marla nodded, wiping her eyes. "I didn't think it was possible, but Here we are. Jordan, still holding the violin in his hands, looked at Keanu. Thank you for helping us find each other. I didn't know if I ever would. Keanu shook his head. It wasn't me. It was the music. You both had it in you all along. I'm just glad I could witness it. There was a long pause before Jordan spoke again, his voice soft. I think she's finally at peace now, and I can finally hear her. Marla's lips trembled, and she nodded again. She didn't have to say anything more. The truth was in the air between them, in the silence after the music had ended. Keanu turned, glancing down at his phone briefly before looking back at them. I think it's time, he said softly. Time for you both to share this with the world. Marla stood up, holding her violin with newfound confidence. Jordan followed her lead, and the two of them stood there, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. Keanu smiled to himself, turning away to give them their space. There was no grand finale, no immediate applause, just two people, once lost, now found through the power of music and love. And that was enough. As he walked away, Keanu glanced over his shoulder one last time. The city around him seemed a little quieter now, a little more connected. The healing had begun, and he had been a part of it. But more importantly, he had witnessed it, and that, he knew, was all that mattered. Keanu sat at his desk late into the evening, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face. The day had been filled with meetings and press, but now he had a moment of peace. He typed the words carefully, as if this would be the final part of a story that had been writing itself for months. The video had gone viral, just as he hoped. The footage of Marla and Jordan playing together had touched something deep inside people. It wasn't just the music. It was the connection, the years of separation that had finally been bridged through the simplest, most profound form of art. Keanu clicked the post button and the story went live. He shared their journey, how the violin, the brokenness, and the quiet healing had brought two people back together. He focused on the music that had once been lost and was now, finally, being shared with the world. But he didn't mention names. He didn't need to. The story, he knew, would do the talking. The title of the post was simple: A Violin on a Sidewalk, The Power of Reconciliation. Keanu didn't expect the flood of responses that came next. As the night wore on, he checked his phone over and over, the notifications flooding in. Messages, comments, even direct messages from people who shared their own stories of reconciliation and healing. Some were long, others brief, but each one shared a common theme: sound, silence, and the power of hearing. One comment from a woman named Sarah read, I didn't think my father would ever forgive me, but when I heard him play piano again after all these years, it was like I could hear everything we had left unsaid, and suddenly, it was enough. Keanu read it twice. A tear slipped down his cheek unbidden. He had always known that music was a bridge, but now he could see just how many people were reaching out across their own gaps. How many people were listening for that final note, for that last moment of understanding. Another comment from a man named Alex said, I thought I'd lost my mother forever when she passed, but when I walked down the street one day and heard a street musician playing her favorite song on the violin, I knew she was still with me. I forgave myself and I forgave her all at once. Keanu didn't respond to the comments immediately. He didn't have to. The stories were already speaking louder than anything he could say. Hours passed, and the comments kept coming. People shared their own moments of sound and silence. Some stories were full of joy, others were heart-wrenching. Each one was a testament to the power of what had happened on that street corner. Two people healing through the music they had almost lost. Keanu's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Sophia. We've got a problem. This post is getting too big. It's going viral. People are starting to post videos of their own street performances, playing songs for parents, for loved ones who are gone. It's becoming a movement. Keanu's heart raced. This was more than he had expected, but he couldn't deny it. There was something real happening here. People who had been living with regret, with silence, were finding their voices again. They were sharing their stories, their sounds. They were forgiving, and they were being forgiven. He sat back in his chair, taking in the gravity of what had begun. The posts were pouring in from around the world. "I'm playing for my mom tonight, the song she never got to hear." Another one, "I'm playing this for my dad, for all the things I never said." And then there was one that really stood out. "To the one who didn't forget me, you changed my life." It was this last comment that stopped Keanu in his tracks. The words were simple, but the sentiment was profound. These were the moments that mattered, the quiet, humble acts of love and understanding that transcended time and distance. Keanu sat back, his eyes flicking over the screen. The comments continued to flood in. Each one seemed to carry a quiet intensity, as if everyone involved in the conversation had been holding their breath for far too long. He watched, fascinated, as more and more videos started popping up. People were playing their own versions of the song Marla had never finished, and the responses were all heartfelt and raw. Some had violins, others had guitars, some even just their voices, but the common thread was clear. They were all telling their own story through music. Stories of loss, of redemption, of silent years and unsaid words. One video, posted by a teenager named Lily, showed her playing a simple melody on a worn-out guitar, the camera shaky as she smiled through her tears. She wrote in the caption, "I'm playing this for my dad. I never told him I loved him enough, but I'm telling him now." Keanu felt a lump form in his throat. These were the moments that music was meant for. Not just performances, but pure human connection. His heart swelled with emotion as the flood of shared experiences continued. Across social media, the hashtag #MirrorMusic began trending, and soon, it wasn't just about Marla's song anymore. It was about music becoming a channel for everyone's hidden grief, their unspoken apologies, and their hopes for healing. Keanu clicked on another video, this one from a middle-aged man named Richard. He stood in front of a modest house, holding a saxophone in his hands. As the music began to fill the air, it was clear this wasn't just a song, it was a conversation, a message. His lips quivered slightly as he played, and in the background, a photo of a woman appeared on the screen. Richard's caption read, "To the one I never got to say goodbye to. This is for you. You gave me everything, and I never told you how much you mattered." Keanu swallowed hard, the weight of the message not lost on him. Every one of these stories resonated, building into something much bigger than just Marla's violin. It was a universal truth about how music had the power to bring healing and forgiveness when words could not. He scrolled down further, reading more responses, more videos. Some people were performing the music for people they had lost, others for people they had never told how much they mattered. He couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. For Marla, for Jordan, for everyone who had unknowingly set this movement in motion. It wasn't just about finishing a song anymore. It was about allowing people to be seen, to be heard, to heal through the shared power of music. And it was growing. It was spreading. Keanu had no idea how far this would go, but he knew that this was bigger than anything he had ever expected. A notification popped up on his screen and he clicked it to see what it was, a new comment. A letter had been sent to the foundation. Keanu opened the letter, his eyes scanning the message. The words were simple, but they carried a weight far beyond the text. "This movement saved my life. I'm writing this letter because I finally told my mother I loved her. I never thought I could. I never thought I had the strength. But I played for her, and she heard me. I never got to say goodbye, but you helped me say it. Thank you for giving me that." Keanu set the phone down for a moment, taking a deep breath. These were the moments that kept him going, the quiet victories, the moments of deep connection and healing that no one saw except the people involved. He could feel the warmth spreading through him as the movement continued to grow. The next morning, he woke up to even more letters and comments. The hashtag had gained incredible traction, and people all over the world were beginning to share their own versions of the story, their own music, their own healing. Keanu couldn't help but smile. What started as a simple story about one woman's music had evolved into something so much more. It had become a movement that bridged generations, crossed boundaries, and gave people the space to heal in ways they had never been able to before. By the end of the week, the Foundation's mailroom was overflowing. Stacks of handwritten letters lined the tables, most of them labeled the same way: "To the one I didn't say enough to," or "For the silence I couldn't fix." Many included song lyrics, music notations, or photos of loved ones. Some included videos on USB drives, street performances, porch melodies, whispered lullabies played into the wind. They came from every age, every country, from small towns in rural America to bustling neighborhoods in Tokyo. The sound of reconciliation was echoing. Keanu stood in the center of it all, humbled. Sophia walked in holding a handful of new envelopes. "They just keep coming," she said, a mix of disbelief and awe in her voice. Keanu nodded slowly, because people have things they never said, songs they never played. He picked up one envelope and read the note inside. A teenage boy from Seattle had written, "My dad and I stopped talking 5 years ago, but last night I sat outside his window and played our old duet on my cello. He opened the door. He said, 'You remembered.' That's all he said, and that was enough." Another letter came from a woman in Brazil. "My daughter hasn't spoken to me in 6 years. She saw your story, heard the music, and sent me a voice message, her playing the violin for the first time since she was a child. I cried the whole time. I thought I'd never hear from her again." Keanu tucked the letters gently into a box labeled Mirror Music Movement. He wasn't collecting them for display or press. He was preserving something sacred. Proof that even broken relationships could echo with beauty if someone dared to make the first sound. A week later, the Foundation hosted a quiet gathering in the city square. There was no banner, no PR push, just a sign that read, "Play for the ones who waited." People showed up in droves. Some brought instruments, others came with just a voice or a phone playing a track. It wasn't a concert, it was a vigil, a soft rebellion against silence, a celebration of music as apology, as memory, as truth. Marla and Jordan stood in the back, watching. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The sounds that filled the square, scattered notes, unfinished pieces, whispered lyrics, were theirs too. Jordan leaned toward Keanu, who had just arrived. "I didn't think anything would come of it. I thought it would just be for her. For us." Keanu shook his head. "It's for all of us now." The night ended not with applause, but with a hush. People stayed long after the last note, sitting in silence, holding each other's hands, or placing small handwritten messages at the base of a shared platform where the instruments had rested. At the center of the platform was a single violin, left behind by a girl who had simply written, "She never heard me play, but now she does." And around that violin, stories continued to bloom. It was Jordan's idea. The community concert had been announced weeks before, a small open-air performance organized by local musicians to raise money for music programs in underfunded schools. Jordan had agreed to participate without much thought, until he saw the final set list and realized something was missing. He didn't bring it up immediately. Instead, he waited until the rehearsal ended and most of the musicians had packed their instruments. Then he walked over to where Keanu and Marla stood at the edge of the stage, watching the last of the students take down folding chairs. "I want her to play with me," Jordan said quietly, directing the words at Keanu, but not taking his eyes off Marla. Marla turned slowly. Her first instinct was to smile, maybe laugh it off like a compliment, but when she saw the seriousness in his face, her throat tightened. "I haven't performed in years," she said. Jordan shrugged gently. "You did last week, and before that in the alley. That was real." Marla looked down at her hands. That wasn't a performance. That was memory. Jordan stepped closer. That was forgiveness. And now it's time for music. Marla looked at Keanu, searching for a signal, an answer, anything to help her make sense of this. Keanu didn't speak. He just gave her that steady, quiet nod, the one he reserved for moments that mattered, moments where choice and courage meet. Still, she hesitated. What if I freeze up? What if I ruin it? You won't, Jordan said. He paused, then added, I used to wonder if I lost the rhythm because you left. But the truth is, I kept it because you were there first. Marla's eyes brimmed with tears. He continued, I don't need a perfect duet. I just want to share a stage with you. I want them to hear you. There was something about the way he said it. Not demanding, not pleading, just honest. Marla finally exhaled. Her fingers curled slightly, remembering the shape of the bow, the weight of the strings, the way time used to vanish when the music started. All right, she said quietly. One rehearsal. Jordan smiled. That's all I need. The next afternoon, they met in the same community hall where the concert would take place. Keanu was already there, along with Sophia, who had offered to help coordinate the equipment and lighting. She brought a camera, just in case. When Marla opened her violin case, the sound of the latches snapping open echoed like a memory. Jordan took out his own instrument, tuning it without words. They sat side by side under soft stage lighting, the dusty velvet curtain half drawn behind them. Marla glanced at him and said, Don't rush the middle section. You always used to speed up. Jordan chuckled, still bossy. You're still sloppy, she teased, then added more softly. But you never lost the beat. Jordan turned to her, bow in hand. I got it from you. The first few notes were rough, hesitant. Marla's fingers trembled slightly as she positioned them on the strings. Her bow dragged just a fraction too long. Jordan noticed but said nothing. He simply adjusted, shifting his own pace to match hers. The melody took shape slowly, like breath returning to lungs after too long underwater. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't supposed to be. This wasn't about getting everything right. It was about reaching for something they had both lost and never thought they'd hold again. They started with a familiar piece, one she used to hum to herself in the alley when the nights got cold. The same tune Jordan had unknowingly adopted and modified during his career, never knowing its origin. Now, for the first time, they played it side by side. Jordan took the lead on the first phrase, his bow sure, his expression focused. Marla followed a beat behind, catching the rhythm like a second wind. Her grip steadied, the tension in her shoulders softened. By the time they hit the midpoint, they were no longer two musicians struggling to find harmony. They were mother and son telling the same story through different hands. Keanu sat in the back of the hall, arms folded, eyes focused on the stage. He said nothing. But Sophia, seated next to him, whispered under her breath, It's like watching time rewind. He nodded once, slowly. Or like watching it heal. On stage, Marla and Jordan approached the final verse of the piece, and something shifted. Jordan added a variation, a change in phrasing that hadn't been in the sheet music. Marla hesitated for half a second, then caught on. Her response wasn't exact, but it was beautiful. Looser, more emotional. The music soared. Their duet became a dance of mutual recognition. Jordan played boldly, Marla with quiet intensity. It wasn't a mother leading a child or a child guiding a parent. It was two equals rediscovering each other through the thing that had always lived between them, even in silence. As the final notes echoed into the rafters, they both lowered their bows. Neither of them moved at first. Their breaths were shallow, eyes down, as if trying to hold on to the moment a little longer. Then Jordan let out a small laugh, brushing his arm against Marla's. You slowed down at the end. I didn't want it to stop, she said softly. Neither did he. Sophia, who had been quietly filming from the wings, snapped a still shot without them noticing. In the image, their silhouettes were perfectly framed by the soft stage lighting. Two bowed heads, two violins resting against their knees, and a silence so full it might as well have been another verse. She looked down at the preview on her screen and smiled. They're ready. The following day they met again, this time in the morning when the hall was empty and the sun poured through the side windows in long golden shafts. There were no other performers yet, no stage crew, no sound checks, just the two of them, their instruments, and a second chance at something they'd both once believed was long gone. Marla tuned her violin slowly. Jordan stood off to the side, pacing with quiet energy, his fingers twitching slightly. He glanced over at her and said, "It still feels unreal." She smiled, brushing a strand of gray hair behind her ear. "That's because it is." He laughed, the sound light and boyish, like a version of himself long buried. "It's also strange. I spent most of my life trying to forget what I didn't understand. Now I realize everything I play, it started with you." Marla didn't look up at first. She tightened one last string, then lifted her head. "I didn't forget you, Jordan. I just didn't know how to carry both the music and the pain." Jordan nodded. "I think I always knew that. I just didn't have the words until now." They didn't rehearse like they had the day before. There was no stopping or correcting. This time, they played to remember, each note a thread stitching something back together. What they lacked in polish, they more than made up for in presence. The music wasn't flawless, but it was alive. During a pause between movements, Jordan set his violin down and stretched. "You know what I realized?" he said, looking over at her. "We don't need to tell them what this is. Not the audience, not anyone." Marla raised an eyebrow, curious. "No program notes?" "No labels, no explanations," he smiled. "They'll feel it." She laughed softly. "That's what your grandfather used to say. If they don't feel it, words won't help." Jordan picked up his violin again, smiling to himself. "Guess it runs in the family." They continued to rehearse, not out of obligation, but because neither of them wanted it to end. As noon approached and the crew began to trickle into the venue, Marla and Jordan stayed close to the side of the stage, still playing, still talking through melodies without words. At one point, Keanu stepped into the hall and caught the last few bars of their song. He didn't speak or wave. He just stood there, taking in the moment. Sophia snapped one last photo, a wide shot of the stage as Marla and Jordan leaned into the final harmony. Their bows crossed paths one last time, strings vibrating in perfect unison. Later that evening, that photo would hang in the Foundation's gallery, beneath a small placard that read, "The final rehearsal wasn't about the notes. It was about remembering who we are when we're finally heard." The concert was unlike any other. There was no grand auditorium, no red velvet curtains, no stone pillars framing the scene. It was a city block, closed off for the evening, transformed into a place of quiet reverence. Folding chairs lined the pavement. String lights hung from cables stretched between lampposts, casting a golden glow that softened the edges of the tall buildings. The hum of the city was still there, but tonight it played second to something more sacred. At the center of the impromptu stage sat the orchestra, local players, music students, and professional musicians, many of whom had been inspired by the story that had traveled across the internet like wildfire. They tuned their instruments, adjusted their bows, and spoke in hushed tones, waiting for the signal. Every seat was filled, except one. Near the front of the ensemble, next to Jordan's place on the left, sat an empty chair. It was deliberate. A space left open with care, no one touching it, no one questioning it. On the back of the chair hung a thin silk scarf, fluttering slightly in the breeze. The orchestra knew who the chair belonged to. Marla hadn't arrived yet. Keanu stood in the back of the gathering crowd, arms folded, eyes scanning the street. He wore no suit, no press badge, just a sweater and jeans. Tonight wasn't about names. It was about moments. The program had already been distributed. 3 songs, each one arranged to feature violin solos that rose like whispers above the swell of the ensemble. The final piece, untitled on the sheet, had only a description: for those who never got to say goodbye. As the conductor raised his baton and signaled for the first movement to begin, a hush fell over the crowd. And that's when she appeared. From between 2 speakers near the edge of the stage, Marla stepped forward. She walked slowly, deliberately, her frame thin but upright. In her arms, carefully folded, was the blanket, the same one she had offered Keanu that night outside the studio gate. Worn, faded, edges frayed by time, but still warm in its presence. The musicians noticed her at once, but no one moved. They simply watched. Marla walked to the empty chair and gently laid the blanket across it. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The gesture was enough. She took her seat, picked up her violin, and tucked it beneath her chin. There was no spotlight, just the soft gleam of the string lights and the natural hush that settled over the city when something real was happening. She glanced at Jordan. He nodded once. The conductor lowered his baton, giving them their cue. And the music began. The first note rose like breath. Marla's bow drew across the strings with a softness that made the air itself lean in to listen. Jordan's reply came half a heartbeat later, steady and warm. Together, their instruments wove a melody that didn't ask for attention. It earned it. People in the crowd leaned forward. Phones were lowered. Conversations stopped. Somewhere near the front, a child sat cross-legged on the curb, eyes wide, hands folded, as though in prayer. The music grew in gentle waves, not loud, not aggressive. It didn't shout, it spoke. It carried the weight of years, of absence, of what was lost and what had finally found its way back. The melody wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. Every note Marla played told a piece of her story: grief, regret, joy, and Jordan's harmony wrapped around it like forgiveness in real time. Keanu stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the 2 of them from behind the crowd. His heart ached in the best way possible, the kind of ache you only feel when you know something is finally being made right. Sophia stood beside him, camera hanging at her side, forgotten. She whispered, "You ever see someone come back to life?" Keanu nodded once, just did. As the duet reached the middle section, the music slowed. It was the part Marla used to stop at, the part she'd never finished. Her fingers paused on the strings, and for a brief second, the breath of the entire street seemed to catch. Then Jordan leaned forward, nodding almost imperceptibly. She nodded back and played through. The melody changed slightly, not in tune, but in tone. It was softer now, fuller, like something that had been broken finding the courage to be whole again. Her hand no longer shook. Her bow didn't hesitate. She finished the section, and as she did, Jordan picked up the final phrase with a phrase of his own. His version, his voice. Together they completed what had once been lost. As the final notes stretched into the night, no one clapped. Not yet. Because no one wanted to break it, the silence that followed the last chord. It was a silence filled with meaning, with memory, with awe. When the applause did begin, it wasn't loud. It was slow, gentle. It started with a few hands, then a few more, and then the whole street was on its feet, clapping not for performance, but for presence, for courage, for love. Marla lowered her violin. Jordan set his bow down. They turned slightly to one another, and Jordan reached for her hand. She took it. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. The city had already heard everything that mattered. After the final piece, as the crowd slowly dispersed and the hum of the city crept back in, Marla remained seated. She didn't stand to bow. She didn't seek applause. She just sat with her hands resting in her lap and the violin still nestled against her side, like a memory she wasn't ready to release. The blanket remained draped over the chair, faded, worn but proud. To the audience, it might have looked like a simple gesture, but to Marla, it was something else entirely. It was the bridge between her lowest moment and this one. It was the warmth she offered a stranger when she had nothing left. It was the last thing she had carried with her through years of silence. Jordan crouched beside her, glancing at the crowd still lingering on the sidewalks. "You okay?" She nodded slowly. "Better than okay." Keanu approached from the side, quiet as ever. His eyes found the blanket first, then her. Marla looked up at him. "I never thought I'd see a night like this." Keanu sat in the empty chair beside her, the one Jordan had vacated. "You didn't just see it," he said. "You made it." She looked out over the street, the folding chairs now half empty, the streetlights flickering back into focus, the makeshift stage slowly returning to sidewalk and scaffolding. She noticed a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, holding her mother's hand. The child turned and waved. Not at anyone in particular, just to the space where the music had been. Marla's eyes glistened. Jordan stood now, speaking with some of the organizers. Reporters were arriving with gentle curiosity, but not pushing in. Something about the tone of the evening demanded reverence. Sophia snapped one last photo. Marla on the chair, Keanu beside her, the blanket folded quietly over the back like a flag that had earned its place. As she reviewed the image on her camera, Sophia whispered, "This is the story people needed." Keanu agreed. Later that night, when the crowd had finally thinned and the lights were being taken down, Marla stood and carefully folded the blanket. She held it to her chest for a moment, then looked at Keanu. "I think I'd like to leave it here," she said, "on the chair." Keanu didn't ask why. He just nodded. She draped it over the back once more, smoothing the edges. It looked like it belonged there, not as decoration, as testimony. A small boy wandered up and looked at the chair. "Whose blanket is that?" he asked. Marla bent down beside him, her voice soft. It belonged to someone who thought she had nothing left to give, but it turned out she still had music. The boy nodded solemnly, as if he understood more than he could say. And with that, Marla stepped away, not as someone forgotten, but as someone remembered. Not for being lost, but for finding her way back. The video was never meant to go viral. Sophia had uploaded it late that night, a quiet post with no hashtags, no push notifications, no sensational title. Just the raw footage of Marla and Jordan playing beneath the string lights. The street-turned stage, the blanket visible behind her chair. The title was simple. She played for him, and we all heard it. By morning, it had 500,000 views. By noon, it passed 2 million. People didn't just watch the video, they listened to it. Some left comments describing how they'd cried. Others said they showed it to their parents, their children, their estranged siblings. One person wrote, "I watched it with the lights off and my phone on mute. I didn't need to hear it. I felt it." The story spread faster than anyone could predict. Major media outlets started calling the foundation. Everyone wanted the full story. Who was the woman? Who was the man? What was the song? What had happened between them? Keanu read every request silently. Then he declined each one. On behalf of Marla, on behalf of Jordan. His message was always the same. This was never for headlines. It was for a son who listened. Reporters persisted. Offers came in to turn the story into something more. Feature interviews, news segments, even docuseries. One network executive promised a 6-figure option if they could sit Marla down in front of a camera. Keanu didn't even tell her. He knew she'd say no. Instead, he responded with a short email. This wasn't a performance. It was a return. As the video continued to circulate, people around the world began to hold their own tribute concerts. Small gatherings in public spaces, often without formal programs or even chairs. Some came with violins, others with flutes, some just with open hands. They played not to be noticed, but to feel close to someone they'd missed. One night, a stranger left a bouquet of violets on the chair Marla had played in. No note, just the flowers. 3 days later, a group of high school students performed their spring recital outside a homeless shelter in her honor. They played her piece, what the community had started calling the blanket song. And in the days that followed, messages continued to pour in from around the world. From India, this reminded me of my mother's voice. From Poland, we played it in my grandmother's kitchen with spoons and pots. She smiled. From Argentina, I watched this with my daughter. She cried, then hugged me. We hadn't spoken in years. No one knew the full story, but somehow they knew everything that mattered. A week after the concert, Keanu returned to the Foundation's gallery. He came alone, slipping in before opening hours. The building was quiet, still lit by the soft, natural light filtering in from the tall windows. It smelled faintly of wood polish and old books. Familiar. Grounding. He carried the blanket in his arms. It was the same one Marla had laid across his shoulders that night behind the studio, the same one she carried to the chair before the concert. It had never been washed. Marla had insisted it stay as it was. It carries the years, she'd said. Now it would carry a story. Sophia met him in the central corridor. A section of the exhibit space had been cleared. A single pedestal stood beneath a spotlight, framed by deep blue walls. Above it, they had placed a small bronze plaque, engraved with just 5 words. Kindness in the cold, Marla's blanket. Keanu gently unfolded it, then stepped back as Sophia arranged it with gloved hands. She didn't spread it out completely. She folded it halfway and let one corner drape over the edge, as if it had just been used, as if someone had just risen from the chair and left it there, waiting. They stood in silence. Around them, other pieces filled the gallery. A pair of gloves left on a park bench with a note that read, "Stay warm today." A cup of soup paid forward by a stranger at a corner diner. A journal found in a subway station, filled with poems written to no one in particular. But none of them seemed to carry the same stillness as this. The blanket didn't shout, it whispered. When the exhibit opened later that week, people stood before it for long stretches of time, some with arms crossed, some with tears on their cheeks. Many didn't read the plaque. They didn't need to. The moment they saw the blanket frayed, soft, folded with care, they understood. The foundation began receiving letters again. Some were short. "I gave my scarf to a man at the bus stop today. I told him I'd seen something beautiful." Others were long. "My mother taught me to play piano. We haven't spoken in 6 years. I sent her the video. She called me today. We didn't talk about the past, just about music." There were sketches too. Children sending in crayon drawings of street musicians and blankets with hearts on them. One young girl mailed a handmade thank you card with a violin sticker on the front and, inside, wrote, "Tell the lady her music made my mom smile again." Keanu read every letter. Sophia posted a few on the wall beside the display. The gallery began to feel less like a museum and more like a sacred space, one built on memory, humility, and the kind of love that often goes unnoticed, but never unheard. 1 month after the performance, Keanu was invited to speak at a fundraiser for music education in underserved communities. The event was formal. Black tie, white tablecloths, the kind of place where people talked more about art than actually experienced it. He almost said no, but something pulled him there. When his name was called, he walked to the podium slowly, no notes in hand. The crowd applauded politely, waiting for a polished story about programs, budgets, maybe a celebrity anecdote. What they got instead was something quiet. He began with a single sentence. "She gave me her blanket when she had nothing else." The room went still. He didn't name Marla, he didn't name Jordan, he didn't describe the street or the song. He just told the truth in the simplest terms. He played a piece no one had heard in 20 years, and when her son heard it, he didn't need an apology. He heard everything in the sound. He looked out over the audience, donors, business leaders, politicians, and added, "There are people in your cities, in your neighborhoods, who have never had a stage, not because they didn't deserve one, but because we never stopped long enough to listen. A pause. I didn't change their lives, I just didn't walk past them. The silence afterward wasn't awkward. It was respectful, weighty. A few people lowered their eyes, a few wiped their faces. Then the room rose, not with thunderous applause, but with a standing recognition that something had shifted. After the event, a woman approached him in the hallway. She was older, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair and a cane. She said, "My son hasn't spoken to me in years. I didn't know how to reach him." Keanu nodded. "Maybe try music." She smiled. "I used to sing him lullabies." He nodded again. "Start there." That night, back at the foundation, Keanu walked into the gallery alone. The blanket was still there. The violin music from the recording played softly in the background on a loop. A small plaque had been added beside the original. He played for him, and the world finally heard her. He sat on the bench across from the display and watched as a father brought his daughter in, pointing to the blanket, whispering something soft. The girl looked up, curious, then slowly smiled. She reached out and gently placed a tiny origami bird on the floor beside it. Keanu smiled. Some stories didn't need retelling, they just needed to be witnessed. And some music didn't need to be recorded, it just needed to be received. He stood up, turned toward the door, and left the gallery with one final glance at the chair. The blanket still folded like a promise no one had broken. It was early autumn when Marla returned to the street where she once slept. The mornings were cooler now. The leaves curled inward on the sidewalk, rustling softly beneath passing footsteps. The studio where Keanu had first seen her still stood, its back gate unchanged, paint chipped, the metal frame slightly bent, but everything else had shifted. She wasn't there to rest now. She was there to give back. Marla had taken a small room nearby, one offered by a local outreach nonprofit that partnered with the foundation. But most days, she could be found in the same alley where her blanket had once been her only shelter. Except now, instead of curling into herself to stay warm, she stood tall, with a violin in hand and a circle of children at her feet. They came from all corners of the neighborhood. Kids from shelters, group homes, transitional housing. Some were shy, some were loud. Some had never touched an instrument. But all of them came back, again and again, because Marla didn't just teach music. She taught listening. "Feel it before you play it," she'd tell them, pressing a small hand to a chest before placing it on a string. They called her Miss Marla. Some still lived in tents or spent nights in shelters, but in that alley, they played. She taught them basic chords, posture, patience. She never raised her voice, never forced a note. And slowly, as the weeks passed, the alley began to sound different. Where once only silence had lived, now came music, halting, joyful, unsure, brave. One afternoon, as Marla handed out sheet music printed with handwritten annotations, a familiar figure leaned against the far brick wall, half-shadowed by the edge of the building. Jordan. He didn't say anything, he just watched. She saw him and smiled, but didn't wave. She knew his rhythm now. He came quietly, stayed just long enough, and left before the last note. But this time, he stayed. The children finished a piece and packed up their instruments. A few lingered, asking for help tuning their strings or drawing stars on their practice logs. Marla took her time with each one, then finally, the alley was empty except for her and her son. Jordan stepped forward slowly. "You teach better than you perform," he teased. She smiled. "That's because I know what it feels like to be unheard." He nodded, eyes gentle. "They hear you now." She gestured toward a second chair beside her folding music stand. "Want to sit?" He hesitated only a second. "Sure." He took his place. No cameras, no microphones, just two people with instruments and the ghosts of what was, and something unspoken between them. An invitation, maybe. Or a homecoming. They didn't need to ask what they would play. Marla reached for her violin, its wood darkened with years and memory. Jordan loosened the bow from his case, pulled a rosin cloth from his pocket, and slowly rubbed the strings. They moved in silence, in rhythm, like two dancers who hadn't rehearsed but still remembered the steps. The alley was quiet now, the kind of quiet that carries everything it touches. Marla set the violin beneath her chin. Jordan nodded, waiting. She began. The opening notes were slower than before, deliberate, careful, but there was strength in them. Jordan entered a few beats later, his tone warmer, fuller. The sound that filled the alley wasn't meant for a crowd. It was for the cracks in their memory, the ones they'd tiptoed around for years. A duet without applause? They played through the first section, their bows rising and falling in a call and response older than either of them could explain. The melody, once haunted by silence, now shimmered with something else. Not hope, not regret, recognition. As they moved into the middle of the piece, Jordan shifted slightly in his seat, adding a variation he hadn't played before. His voice responding to hers with a flourish that almost felt like laughter. Marla picked it up instantly. She followed the curve of his improvisation and returned it with something gentler, more resolved. The music became a conversation. Questions in minor keys, answered with soft refrains. A mother and son speaking through strings, each note unraveling what the years had tangled. Keanu stood at the end of the alley, hands in his coat pockets, watching from a distance. He didn't want to interrupt. Didn't even want them to know he was there. This wasn't his moment. It was theirs. Near the final phrase, Marla paused just slightly, her bow hovering an inch from the string. Jordan waited. She met his eyes. He smiled and played the next note, and she followed. This time they finished together. No lingering echo, no final swell. Just the last note, held for a breath longer than necessary, then let go, like an exhale that had waited 20 years. Marla lowered her instrument. Jordan rested his in his lap. No one clapped. There was no audience. Just the wind shifting past them, and a feeling, one too big for words, too still for motion. She looked at him. That was the best we've ever played it. Jordan nodded, because this time we didn't play to be heard. He paused, voice softer. We played to remember. After the final note, they didn't speak for a while. Marla rested her violin gently back in its case, running a soft cloth across the strings with the tenderness of someone closing a chapter rather than putting away an object. Jordan adjusted the tuning pegs on his instrument with quiet care, though they were already perfect. Sometimes, it's not about tuning. It's about holding on, just a little longer. The sun had dipped behind the rooftops now, casting the alley in a warm amber hue, the kind of light that made the cracks in the bricks look golden instead of broken. Jordan looked around and said, "You still come here every week?" Marla nodded. "Tuesdays and Thursdays, after lunch. The kids bring more than just questions. They bring their stories. You give them more than music," he said. "You give them a place to show up." She smiled. "That's all I ever wanted, a place I could show up to." Jordan looked down at his lap. "I used to think you left because of me." Her eyes softened. "I left because I didn't know how to stay. But you were never the reason. You were the reason I came back." He nodded slowly, a quiet breath leaving his chest like something he hadn't realized. He'd been holding all this time. From around the corner, the sound of laughter echoed. Kids finishing school, neighbors talking, a bus driving past with its brakes hissing. The world had moved on. But somehow, here in this small square of the city, time had folded in on itself, letting the two of them finish something that had waited far too long. Jordan stood and stretched. "I should go. Rehearsal in the morning." Marla rose too, slower but steady. "Tell your section leader I said to stop letting the cellos overpower the violas." He raised an eyebrow. "You've been watching." Always. He leaned in, kissed her forehead lightly, and whispered, "See you Thursday?" She smiled. "I'll bring the good rosin." He chuckled as he walked off, violin case in hand, vanishing into the fading evening light. Marla remained for a while longer, tidying the folding chairs the children had left behind, stacking their sheet music, humming a tune beneath her breath. It wasn't the same melody they'd played, but it carried the same weight. The kind of tune that doesn't fill a stadium, but fills the quiet spaces people often forget to look into. And when she finally left, violin in one hand and a folded blanket in the other, the alley was empty again. But not silent. Not anymore. Because some music doesn't echo, it stays. Sometimes the most beautiful songs begin with silence, and sometimes the coldest night gives you a blanket and a violin. Marla never asked for anything, not food, not shelter, not even help. All she gave was warmth. To a stranger she recognized in a moment of instinct, not because of who he was, but because she remembered what it felt like to be cold and invisible. She gave without asking, and in return the world gave her back a piece of herself. The concert in the street didn't change the world, but it changed something inside the people who watched. The young woman who called her mother for the first time in years, the teenager who picked up an old instrument again, the father who whispered to his daughter during the final note, "This is what music is supposed to sound like." The foundation received more than just letters after the performance. It received stories, hundreds of them. Small moments that reminded us that kindness is not about grand gestures, but about being seen and seeing others. A coat passed to a stranger, a lullaby sung in a hospital room, a song played under a bridge, not for coins, but for connection. One woman wrote, "I gave a man an apple once. He cried. I didn't understand why until I saw your video. It wasn't the apple. It was that someone noticed he was still there." The city didn't become quieter after Marla and Jordan played their duet. It became more awake, more alert to the small things, more attuned to sound, to softness, to memory. Marla still teaches. She still folds the blanket neatly when she's done for the day. Jordan visits more often now. Not every time, but often enough that the children have started calling him the tall one with the kind eyes. They don't know who he is. They don't need to. Because what matters isn't who you are when you arrive. It's how you listen and how you leave someone better than you found them. We often think change has to be loud, but sometimes it begins with a blanket offered without question, or a violin played beneath a street lamp, or a song you never got to finish until someone sat beside you and played the rest. This story wasn't just about music. It wasn't just about Marla or Jordan or the cold night when a woman gave everything she had left to a man she didn't know. It was about what happens when you listen long enough to hear the quiet things people carry. So now, we ask you, has someone ever given you something small that changed everything? It doesn't have to be a violin. Maybe it was a ride home when you had no way to ask for one. Maybe it was a note slipped into your hand when you were at your lowest. Maybe it was a song, a book, a meal, or even a moment. One so brief, so unassuming it almost disappeared, but didn't. Tell us below. Tell us who gave it to you. Tell us what it meant. Your story may become someone else's reminder that kindness doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be real. And if this story reminded you of someone you've lost, or someone you've found again, share it, because that's how stories like this one keep echoing. That's how they become more than memories. They become music. One more thing before we go. The next story begins in a graveyard. It begins with a man who sleeps beside the same stone every night. People walk past him every day, assuming they know his story. But Keanu stops. And what he finds buried beneath that headstone will challenge everything he thought he knew about loss, loyalty, and love. Stay with us, because sometimes the next story isn't about what you hear, it's about what you dare to ask.